The Serpent in the Sanctuary, Part 1, A Body in the Bell Tower. It is a curious thing how the most dreadful events so often dawn with perfect tranquility. That Tuesday in St. Mary Mead was one such morning. The sun was warm, the bees hummed in the lupins, and the only discord was a determined march of my friend, Dorothy Bantry, up my garden path. Her knock on my cottage door was a rapid staccato of pure agitation. I called out that the door was open and the kettle was on. Dorothy swept in, a whirlwind of distress in a sensible tweed coat. "Jane, you must come at once," she declared, breathless. "It's the most dreadful business. Simply dreadful." I guided her to a chair. "A cup of Earl Grey will settle your nerves, Dorothy. Now, what is it? Has the vicar's wife proposed abstract sculptures for the altar again?" "Worse! It's the Summer Garden Fête Committee. Colonel Prescott and Miss Lavinia Thorne are at war. The Marquis, the Raffle, the Fête Queen. He wants his niece, Chloe, crowned. She insists on that new post office girl, Sarah Wainwright. They're impossible." The St. Mary Mead Summer Garden Fête was a pinnacle of our village social calendar, a quiet battleground of jams, carnations, and fiercely competitive cake judging. Dorothy spoke of it as if it were the defense of the realm. "I need you on the committee, Jane," she pleaded. "You're the only one they both respect. You can be our diplomat." I had little desire to debate coconut ice versus fudge, but I saw my friend's genuine distress. Furthermore, such friction in a small community often reveals fascinating truths about the human heart. I agreed. 2 days later, I found myself in the village hall, a place that smelled perpetually of dust and forgotten ambitions. The committee was assembled. At one end of the long table sat Colonel Arthur Prescott, red-faced and bristling with military efficiency. At the other sat Miss Lavinia Thorne, tall and austere, her silver hair in a severe bun, her gaze as sharp as a hawk's. Between them sat the others, young Chloe Prescott, pretty and bored, Mr. Henderson, the timid bank manager, and Sarah Wainwright, the gentle, observant postmistress. "The crown must go to a girl who represents the best of St. Mary Mead," the colonel boomed, striking the table. "Good family, fine character. My Chloe is the obvious choice." Miss Thorne's voice was like cut glass. "Nonsense, Arthur. This is about community spirit, not nepotism. Sarah has done remarkable work with the children's events. She embodies the modern, respectful spirit we should encourage." "I've lived here my whole life," Chloe muttered sullenly. "It's only fair." Sarah shook her head, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Oh, I really don't mind, Miss Thorne. Honestly, Chloe should have it." "You see," the colonel pounced, "the girl has sense. Now, the Marquis. I've secured a larger one from Budgenham, far more impressive." "It will crush the rose beds," Miss Thorne countered instantly. "Absolutely not. We use a traditional Marquis from Croft & Sons, as we always have." I saw my chance. Perhaps a compromise. I suggested gently. The larger Marquis could be positioned on the cricket pitch, adjacent to the rose garden. One can admire both the roses and the spaciousness. A grudging silence fell. My suggestion had momentarily disarmed them. In that quiet, I observed the others. Mr. Henderson polished his spectacles nervously, his eyes darting between the antagonists like a spectator at a tennis match. He was a man whose life was a carefully balanced ledger, and this conflict was a sizable debit. Chloe's boredom was a thin veneer. I saw the flicker of genuine resentment in her eyes when she glanced at Sarah. And Sarah watched Miss Thorne with an expression of gratitude that bordered on devotion. It was all very illuminating. The colonel grumbled, "Well, the cricket pitch might serve, but the Fête Queen is non-negotiable." "On that," Miss Thorne said icily, "we are in complete agreement. It is non-negotiable. Sarah shall be queen." The meeting dissolved shortly after, having settled very little. As we filed out, I saw Miss Thorne place a hand on Sarah's arm. "Do not let him bully you, my dear," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "You have a place here." "Thank you, Miss Thorne," Sarah replied, her eyes slightly watery. "I won't let you down." Nearby, the colonel stumped toward the church, his niece in tow. "Insufferable woman," he muttered, just loud enough to hear. "Thinks she owns a village, and everyone in it." The following day, I was in the church arranging flowers for the altar. The peace was palpable, the dust motes dancing in the colored light from the stained glass windows. I was just finishing with the lilies when a sharp, panicked cry shattered the silence. It was followed by the frantic, discordant clang of the single bell in the tower, not a call to service, but a scream of alarm. I hurried to the base of the bell tower. Young Chloe Prescott was there, her face white as parchment, trembling so violently she could barely stand. She pointed a shaking finger up the narrow, winding staircase. Up, up there, she gasped, her eyes wide with horror. In the belfry. A profound dread propelled me up the steep, cold stairs. The air grew thick with the smell of ancient stone and old wood. As I reached the small, open platform of the belfry, the sight was one of grotesque contradiction. Slumped against the grate, silent bell was the body of Colonel Arthur Prescott. His military bearing was gone, replaced by the awful slackness of death. His head was tilted back, his eyes wide with surprise. But it was the object protruding from his chest that made my breath catch. It was a Fête Queen ceremonial sceptre, a slender, silver-topped rod used for decades in our little pageant. Now, its ornate end was stained a deep, ugly crimson, buried in the colonel's heart. The serpent had found its way into our sanctuary, and the first act of this terrible drama was over. The Serpent in the Sanctuary, Part 2, Webs of Silk and Suspicion. The world seemed to hold its breath in that cold belfry. The only sound was a frantic beating of my own heart, a desperate drum against the silence of the dead. One does not expect to find murder in a place like St. Mary Mead, and certainly not so theatrical a murder. The Fête Queen sceptre, that symbol of innocent village pride, now stood as a grotesque marker of violent death. I knew I had to act quickly, before panic could erode the fragile facts of the matter. "Chloe," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. I descended the winding stairs to find the girl had sunk to the stone floor, sobbing. "Chloe, look at me." She looked up, her face a mask of tear-streaked horror. "You must run to the telephone exchange," I instructed calmly. "Call the police. Then go directly home. Do not speak to anyone. Do you understand? Anyone?" She nodded, a frantic, jerky motion, and scrambled to her feet, fleeing the church as if the devil himself were at her heels. I knew the instruction was perhaps futile. News in St. Mary Mead travels not by wire, but by whisper, and it would be everywhere before the police constable could pedal his bicycle from the next village. But I had to try to contain the chaos. I returned to the belfry, careful not to touch anything. Standing there, looking down at the colonel's still form, I felt a profound sadness. For all his bluster, he was a part of the tapestry of this place. And now, a thread had been violently pulled, unraveling everything. My eyes scanned the small space. No obvious signs of a struggle. The colonel's jacket was unbuttoned, and a small, folded piece of paper, half torn, lay near his foot, almost invisible against the dark stone. It was not my place to disturb it, but I committed its position to memory. The arrival of the police was a slow, cumbersome affair. First, our local constable, a well-meaning but perpetually flustered young man named Perkins, who turned a sickly green at the sight. Then, hours later, the professionals from London. Detective Inspector Martin, a man with the weary eyes of one who has seen too much, and his sharp-eyed sergeant, a woman named Leyland whose quiet efficiency I immediately appreciated. They took my statement in the vicar's study, the scent of old books and beeswax a strange counterpoint to the discussion of murder. "You found the body, Miss Marple," Inspector Morton stated, his voice a low rumble. "A shock for a lady of your years." "One is never too old for a shock, Inspector," I replied, "and unfortunately not too old to recognize evil when one sees it." He grunted, non-committal. "What was your relationship with the deceased?" "We were acquainted, as everyone in the village is acquainted. We served on a committee together. He was a forceful personality, but not, I believe, a malicious one." "The committee for this fate?" Sergeant Leyland asked, her notebook poised. "Yes, there had been some disagreements, primarily between Colonel Prescott and another member, a Miss Lavinia Thorne." The inspector's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Disagreements? Of what nature?" "The selection of the Fête Queen," the placement of the marquee, the usual village politics, though conducted with unusual fervor. I gave them the facts, neat and plain, like a well-darned sock. I did not offer my theories. They were not yet fully formed, mere seedlings of thought. I mentioned the torn paper, and saw Sergeant Leyland make a note. The next day, the village was an overturned beehive, buzzing with a toxic mixture of fear and excitement. The news had spread, as I knew it would. I decided a visit to the Bantry household was in order. Dorothy, I knew, would be a fountain of information, most of it filtered through her own particular dramatics. I found her in her drawing room, fortifying herself with a mid-morning sherry. "Jane, isn't it awful? Murdered. In our own church. I told you the committee was dreadful, but I never imagined this," she exclaimed the moment I entered. "You could not have foreseen this, Dorothy," I said, taking a seat. "It is a tragedy beyond all prediction. They say it was a sceptre, the Fête Queen's own sceptre. The symbolism is Gothic." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Inspector Morton has already been to see Lavinia Thorne. He questioned her for nearly an hour. They had a very public row yesterday, you know, outside the post office. The colonel was shouting about unknown influence, and Miss Thorne looked like she could have killed him on the spot. That is a very unfortunate turn of phrase, Dorothy, but accurate. And that's not all. He has also spoken to young Sarah Wainwright. She was seen crying in the lane behind the post office this morning. They say the inspector asked her about her past, about why she came to St. Mary Mead. It seems our quiet little postmistress might have a history. This was interesting. A history of what? Nobody knows. But isn't that the point? Why be so secretive if there's nothing to hide? I thought of Sarah's grateful, devoted looks towards Miss Thorne. Was it mere gratitude for champion, or the loyalty of a protégé whose protector had removed an obstacle? My next call was on Dr. Haydock, who had performed the initial examination of the body. He was an old friend and knew my interest in the darker puzzles of human nature was not mere morbid curiosity. "Jane," he said, waving me into his surgery, "I suppose you'll hear about the colonel." "You suppose correctly. It is a terrible business." "It is indeed." The wound was precise. A single, powerful thrust went straight between the ribs. Not a random act of violence. Someone knew what they were doing, or were incredibly lucky. Or incredibly angry, I mused. Was there anything else? Anything that seemed out of place? He frowned. "Well, it's probably nothing, but Martin showed me that scrap of paper you spotted. It was a corner torn from a larger sheet. High-quality paper. Expensive. There were just 2 words on it, in a very elegant hand. The sanctuary. The sanctuary. I repeated. It meant nothing to me at the time. Not the belfry or the church. No, the sanctuary. Curious, isn't it? It was more than curious. It was a thread, fine as silk, waiting to be pulled. Leaving the doctor's, I decided to take a walk past Miss Thorne's cottage, the Laurels. It was an impeccably kept house, shrouded in, well, laurels, giving it a secluded, secretive air. As I passed the gate, I saw Sergeant Leyland emerging, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She saw me and gave a curt nod. "Miss Marple." "Sergeant, a difficult day for everyone." "It is. Miss Thorne has been very articulate in her defense." "I am sure she has. She is a woman of strong convictions." "Indeed." The sergeant's sharp eyes seemed to be assessing me. "She claims she was at home all yesterday evening, reading. No witnesses, of course. She did, however, volunteer that she saw Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, walking near the church at an unusually late hour. She described him as looking furtive. That was interesting. Miss Thorne was not just defending herself. She was directing the police's attention elsewhere, towards Mr. Henderson, the nervous little man who hated conflict. Why would he be near the church? And why would Miss Thorne be so quick to point it out? The webs were being woven, thread by thread. The blustering colonel, the austere spinster, the grateful protégé, the timid banker, and the resentful niece, each with their own motives, their own secrets. and at the center of it all, a silver scepter and a cryptic note mentioning a sanctuary. I felt, as I walked home, that I was looking at a tangled ball of yarn. I had found a few loose ends, but pulling the wrong one would only tighten the knot. The quiet of the village was now a facade, and beneath it, a serpent was coiled, waiting to see if it had struck successfully or if its hiding place would be discovered. The Serpent in the Sanctuary, Part 3, A Pattern in the Past. A village under the shadow of murder is a fascinating and rather terrible study in human nature. The initial shock had hardened into a low, constant hum of suspicion. Conversations in the post office or the butcher's shop were now conducted in hushed tones, with eyes that darted towards closed doors and drawn curtains. It was in this atmosphere of quiet dread that I decided to pay a call on the most reluctant figure in our little drama, Mr. Henderson, the bank manager. I found him not at the bank, but at his home, a neat, soulless little villa called Dunroman. The garden was perfectly manicured and utterly without charm. He answered the door himself, his face pale, his spectacles seeming to have slid even further down his nose. He looked, if possible, more nervous than he had in the committee meeting. "Miss Marple, this is a surprise." His eyes darted past me, up and down the quiet street, as if checking to see who had witnessed my arrival. I was just passing Mr. Henderson, and felt I should check in. This dreadful business must be affecting everyone so deeply, especially those who work closely with the Colonel. He ushered me inside with a reluctant hand. The sitting room was as characterless as the garden, furnished with a suite of furniture that looked as if it had never been sat upon. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no clutter. It was the home of a man who did not wish to be known. It's a tragedy," he said, wringing his hand slightly. "A terrible, terrible tragedy. The police, they've already spoken to me. You know." "Oh," I said, settling myself carefully on the edge of a stiff armchair. "I suppose they must speak to everyone. It is their way. Our Inspector Morton seems very thorough." "Thorough?" Henderson gave a short, brittle laugh. "He as good as accused me, because that woman, that Miss Thorne, told him she saw me near the church that night. It's not a crime to take a walk, is it?" "Of course not," I soothed. "The churchyard is a public right-of-way. Many of us find solace there. Were you seeking solace, Mr. Henderson?" He flushed a deep, unhealthy red. I had things on my mind. Business matters. The bank, it can be a pressure. I often walk to clear my head." "I quite understand. And did you see anything? Anyone else about?" I asked, my tone one of mild, polite curiosity. No, I saw no one. It was quiet, perfectly quiet." He was too vehement. His denial was like a slammed door. I knew then that he was lying, but not necessarily about murder. He was hiding something that filled him with shame or fear. "How trying for you," I murmured, "to be caught up in this through simple bad luck. I suppose the police are asking everyone about their interactions with the Colonel. He was a man of strong opinions, was he not? I recall he was quite forceful at our committee meeting." Henderson's eyes widened slightly behind his spectacles. "Forceful? He was a bully, a tyrant." The words burst out of him, startling in their vehemence. He seemed to shock himself, and quickly modified his tone. That is to say, he was very direct, in his business dealings as well. "His business dealings?" I prompted gently. "I cannot discuss a client's affairs," he said, retreating behind a wall of professional discretion. But the wall was cracked. His hands were trembling. Suffice to say, the Colonel was not a man who took no for an answer. He believed his will should be low. I left Dunroman some minutes later, my mind whirring. Henderson's fear was palpable, but it seemed directed at exposure, not arrest. He was terrified of something being revealed, and his outburst about the Colonel being a tyrant in his business dealings, that was a thread worth following. My next visit was to the Grange, the Colonel's home. It was a solid, imposing house, a monument to his military career. It felt empty now, its heart gone. I was received by Chloe Prescott, who looked pale and lost, swamped in a black dress that was too old for her. "Aunt Jane," she said, using the childhood title she bestowed upon me years ago. It's so awful. I can't believe he's gone. It is a terrible loss, my dear, I said, taking her hand. We sat in the grand, cold drawing room. You have had to bear the worst of it, finding him like that. A shudder ran through her. I just went up to the belfry to think. It's quiet up there. I never imagined. She broke off, fresh tears in her eyes. But I noticed something. A flicker of something else beneath the grief. Guilt? The police keep asking me why I was there, as if I had a reason. People often seek high places for contemplation, I said. It is perfectly natural. Tell me, Chloe, was your uncle worried about anything recently? Did he seem troubled? She frowned, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. He was always cross about the fate, of course. But there was something else. He had a row with Mr. Henderson at the bank last week. I came to meet him and heard raised voices from his office. When Uncle Arthur came out, he was in a furious temper. He said something about digging too deep and unearthing things best left buried. Digging too deep. The phrase echoed in the quiet room. It connected perfectly with Henderson's fear. What had the Colonel been digging into? And what of Miss Thorne? I asked gently. Their disagreement was so public. Chloe's face hardened. She hated him. She really did. She thought he was a relic, standing in the way of her modernizing the village. And she had that Sarah wrapped around her little finger. She'd do anything Miss Thorne asked, I'm sure of it. The devotion I had observed was now being framed as a dangerous loyalty. It was a plausible picture, the austere mistress and her willing instrument. As I walked home, the pieces began to shift, forming a new, darker pattern. The Colonel, a bully, had been digging into something. Mr. Henderson, a timid man, was terrified of what the Colonel had unearthed. Perhaps a professional indiscretion, an error in the bank's ledgers he could not afford to have revealed. Was that a motive for murder? For a man like Henderson, whose entire life was built on precision and order, the threat of disgrace might be a powerful spur. And then there was Miss Thorne and Sarah. Their motive was clearer, remove the obstacle to their vision for the village. A strong, traditionalist voice silenced forever. But the clue of the note still puzzled me. The sanctuary. It felt important, a key that did not fit either lock. I decided a quiet word with the vicar was in order. If anyone knew the meanings and histories of our church, it would be him. I found the Reverend Clement in the vestry, looking troubled. Ah, Miss Marple, a dark time for our little flock. Indeed, Vicar, it is a comfort to know the church is still a sanctuary for us all in such times. The word hung in the air between us. A sanctuary, he repeated softly. Yes, though it has been profaned. It is hard to see it as a refuge now. The word has been on my mind. I ventured. I recall, some years ago, there was a small, private charity run by Lady Beaumont. Was there not? I believe she called it the Sanctuary. It was for young women in trouble, I think. The vicar's eyes widened. Good heavens, Miss Marple, what a memory you have. Yes, the Sanctuary. It folded after Lady Beaumont passed away. Oh, must be 15 years ago now. It was a noble endeavor, though rather hushed up, of course. She took in girls who had found themselves in a certain condition, gave them a place to stay, arranged for adoptions. It was all very discreet. A sanctuary for young women in trouble, a place of secrets. And it was connected to the Colonel through that torn piece of high-quality paper. But how? And what could a defunct charity from 15 years ago possibly have to do with his murder now? The pattern was becoming more complex, the threads leading back into the deep shadows of the past. I felt I was no longer just looking for a killer, but an archaeologist carefully brushing away the dust of years to uncover a secret that someone was desperately and fatally trying to rebury. The Serpent in the Sanctuary, Part 4, The Ghost of a Sanctuary. The past, I have found, is never truly dead. It lies in wait, like a seed in winter, and the slightest warmth can bring it to a terrible, unexpected bloom. The mention of Lady Beaumont's sanctuary was such a warmth. It was a piece of the puzzle that belonged not to the present tensions, but to an older, quieter story. I needed to know more, and there was only one person in St. Mary Mead who held the archives of our social history, both written and remembered, Miss Lavinia Thorne. I found her in her garden at the Laurels, pruning her roses with a ferocious precision. She did not look like a woman recently questioned in a murder investigation. She looked like a queen surveying her domain, her posture rigid, her movements exact. "Miss Marple," she said, without looking up from a particularly stubborn branch. "I suppose you are here as an emissary for the village gossips, or perhaps for the police." "I am here as a friend, Miss Thorne," I said, though the statement was perhaps a diplomatic stretch. "These are difficult days for us all. I find myself thinking of the past, of quieter times." She snipped a branch, and it fell to the ground with a finality. "The past is a country we are well rid of. It is the future of this village that concerns me." "Does it?" I asked gently. I was just speaking with the vicar, and we found ourselves reminiscing about Lady Beaumont. Such a force for good. Do you remember her charity? The Sanctuary, I believe it was called. The seccator stilled in her hand. For the briefest of moments, the impeccable composure fractured. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not guilt, but something sharper, more personal. "Alarm. A misguided endeavor," she said, her voice even colder than usual. "Encouraging imprudent behavior. Lady Beaumont was sentimental. The world is not a kind place to sentimentalists, or to the fruits of their sentimentality." It was a harsh, cruel thing to say. It did not match the woman who had championed the kind, gentle Sarah Wainwright so fiercely. "I had heard she helped many young women," I persisted. "Gave them a second chance. I wonder what became of them all." "I have no idea," Miss Thorne said, turning her back to me to address a rose bush of a deep, bloody crimson. "It was a long time ago. The house was sold after her death. The records, if there were any, were scattered. It is of no consequence now." But her reaction told me it was of immense consequence. To her, I had struck a nerve. I had come seeking information about a possible connection to the colonel, but I had instead found a raw and hidden wound in Lavinia Thorne herself. My next step was a public library in the nearby market town of Budgenham. Local archives were kept in a dusty back room, and the librarian, a young man with an impressive enthusiasm for cataloguing, was only too happy to assist. "Lady Beaumont?" "Oh, yes, a prominent figure," he said, leading me to a stack of old ledger books. Her will was quite the topic. Left most of her estate to a nephew, but there was a sizable trust. "Here we are." He laid a heavy, leather-bound book on the table. It was a record of property deeds for the parish. We traced the history of the house Lady Beaumont had used for her charity, a large, secluded property on the edge of the village called Oakwood Lodge. "It was sold after her death," the librarian confirmed, running a finger down the entries. "Let me see. Purchased by her. Mr. Arthur Prescott." The room seemed to grow still. Colonel Prescott. He had bought the very house that had served as a sanctuary. It could not be a coincidence. The torn note in the belfry, the words, "the sanctuary," it was a direct link to him. But why? Had he discovered something about its past? Was that what he had been digging too deep into? And what of the trust? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The one in her will." The librarian shuffled through more papers. "Ah, here. The Lady Beaumont Charitable Trust, established to provide small annuities or grants for the education and welfare of young women of good character who have fallen upon misfortune. The trustees were, let's see, her solicitor, the vicar of St. Mary Mead at the time, and a Miss Lavinia Thorne." The pieces slammed together in my mind with such force it left me breathless. Miss Thorne was a trustee. She had been involved. Her harsh words about the charity being misguided were a lie, a smokescreen. She had a secret connection to that place, to its work, and Colonel Prescott, who owned the property, had somehow stumbled upon it. I returned to St. Mary Mead as dusk was falling, the puzzle now a darker, more intimate thing. It was no longer about a public argument over Fête Queen. It was about a 15-year-old secret, a charity for fallen women, a trusted spinster, and a prying colonel. I needed to speak to Sarah. If Miss Thorne was a key to the past, then Sarah was a link to the present. I found her not at her lodgings, but closing up the post office, her movement slow with exhaustion and grief. Miss Marple, she said, forcing a tired smile. I'm afraid we're closed. I am not here for stamps, my dear, I said. I am here for you. You look worn out. This has been a terrible ordeal. Tears welled in her eyes instantly. They think I had something to do with it, don't they? Because of the silly Fête Queen business. But I didn't. I didn't care about that. I wanted to make Miss Thorne proud. She has been a good friend to you, I prompted gently. The best, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She found me my position here. She believed in me when no one else did. She told me everyone deserves a second chance, a sanctuary, no matter what their past. The word hung in the air between us. Asterisk sanctuary star. And what was your past, Sarah? I asked, my voice as soft as the evening air. She looked at me, and I saw not a cunning murderess, but a lost, frightened girl. I can't. Miss Thorne said I must never speak of it. She said it would ruin everything she'd done for me. She said people like Colonel Prescott would use it against me. And there it was. The connection was complete. Miss Thorne had taken Sarah under her wing, just as Lady Beaumont had taken in other girls. Sarah was a beneficiary of the old sanctuary spirit, perhaps even a direct link to it. The Colonel, digging into the history of the property he owned, or perhaps into Miss Thorne's affairs, had discovered Sarah's secret. A secret Miss Thorne was desperate to keep buried. A secret worth killing for? I walked home in the deepening twilight, the village no longer just a place of quiet suspicion, but of hidden lives and rescued girls. The serpent in our sanctuary was not a stranger. It was a poison that had been growing in the dark for 15 years, and its bite had been fatal. I now knew the asterisk Y star, the terrible, tragic Y, but I was no closer to proving asterisk who star. For while Miss Thorne had the clearest motive, I could not shake the image of Mr. Henderson's terrified eyes. His fear was too real, and it too was connected to the Colonel's prying. The past had not one ghost, but several, and one of them was a murderer. The Serpent in the Sanctuary, Part 5, The Second Visitor. The human heart is a labyrinth of conflicting impulses. Having heard Mr. Henderson's confession, I felt a pang of something akin to pity, mixed with profound unease. His was the panic of a cornered animal, not the cold calculation of a killer, but his story had opened a chasm far darker than mere embezzlement. If Henderson had fled, leaving the Colonel wounded but perhaps alive, then who had been the second visitor to the bell tower, who had found the Colonel and, instead of seeking help, had staged that grisly scene. I needed to find the link between the Colonel's threat, cleaning out the rut ending with that sanctimonious Thorne woman, and the old sanctuary. What secret could be so damning that it would drive someone to murder? My thoughts returned to Sarah Wainwright. She was a key, the living legacy of whatever had transpired all those years ago. I found her arranging daffodils in a vase outside the post office. The bright yellow flowers were a stark contrast to the pallor of her face. Sarah, my dear, I began, my tone gentle. Might I have a word? Inside, perhaps? She looked at me with those wide, anxious eyes, but nodded silently, leading me into the small, stuffy back room of the post office, filled with a scent of ink and old paper. I know this is a difficult time, I said, taking a seat on a wooden crate. But the police are looking in the wrong directions, and I fear an innocent person may suffer. I need to understand your connection to Miss Thorne. It is more than just kindness, isn't it? She twisted her hands in her apron, a familiar gesture of distress. She saved me, Miss Marple. I told you. From what child? I pressed, my voice soft but insistent. The Colonel was asking questions about you, about your past. He discovered something, didn't he? Something connected to Lady Beaumont's sanctuary. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. The dam was breaking. I was born there, she whispered, the words barely audible. At Oakwood Lodge. My mother, she was one of the girls Lady Beaumont took in. She died bringing me into the world. The pieces, once scattered, now began to fly together, forming a picture of heartbreaking clarity. I see, I murmured. And Miss Thorne, she knew your mother. Sarah nodded, wiping her cheek with a rough hand. She was her benefactor. She found her the position here. She promised my mother she would always look after me. And she has. She's the only family I've ever known. It was a touching story, a testament to a lifelong loyalty. But it did not explain the Colonel's threat or motive for murder. There was more. I waited, letting the silence encourage her. The Colonel, he found the old register, Sarah continued, her voice trembling. From the sanctuary, it listed the mothers and the babies, and the fathers, if they were known. She took a shaky breath. My mother listed my father's name. She told Miss Thorne it was a secret, that he was a respected man, recently married to someone else. She made Miss Thorne promise never to reveal it. And the Colonel discovered this. I said, the final, terrible piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He found the register and saw the father's name. Yes, Sarah sobbed. He came to see me 2 days before he died. He was so angry. He said it was a disgrace, a blot on the village's honor. He said he was going to make it public. He said my father was. She couldn't say the name. She didn't have to. I saw it then, with the force of a lightning strike. The identity of Sarah's father, a secret so explosive it could destroy a reputation built over a lifetime. A secret worth killing for. But whose reputation? Not Miss Thorne's. Hers was as a guardian of the secret, not its subject. And then I knew. The pieces rearranged themselves one final time. The high-quality notepaper, the military bearing, the obsession with honor and family name, the furious row with Miss Thorne over a postmistress he barely knew. It wasn't just about village politics. It was personal, deeply, shamefully personal. The Colonel, I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. Colonel Prescott was your father. Sarah crumpled, her body folding in on itself as years of silent pain and rejection poured out. He didn't know. My mother never told him. Miss Thorne said she tried to tell him, after my mother died, but he refused to believe it. He called her a liar, said she was trying to extort money. He wanted nothing to do with me. When he saw the register, he finally had to face the truth. And he hated it. He hated *me star. He said my existence was a stain on his perfect record, an insult to his wife's memory. The motive was now clear as glass. For Miss Thorne, the Colonel's threat to publicly reveal Sarah as his illegitimate daughter was an attack on the girl she had sworn to protect. It would have shattered Sarah, exposed her to ridicule and scorn. For the Colonel, it was a truth that would have destroyed his own meticulously crafted image of honor and lineage. I left the sobbing girl in the back room, my heart heavy. I now understood the second visitor's motive. But which of them had it been? Had Miss Thorne, the fierce protector, gone to the belfry to reason with him, found him wounded from the struggle with Hendosen, and seen a brutal opportunity to silence him forever? Or had Sarah, confronted with her own father's venomous rejection, followed him in a fit of despair and rage? I walked slowly back to my cottage, the gentle sounds of the village feeling like a mockery. I knew the shape of the truth now. I knew of Hendosen's panic crime and the deeper, more passionate motive that had followed. But I still lacked proof. I needed to speak to Miss Thorne one last time. I needed to look into her eyes when I presented her with the full, tragic picture. For I was now certain that one of the two women I had just spoken to was not just a guardian or a victim, but the serpent who had delivered the final, calculated strike. The Serpent in the Sanctuary, Part 6, A Test of Loyalty. Armed with the tragic truth of Sarah's parentage, the pieces of the puzzle now formed a complete, if heartbreaking, picture. Two people had powerful motives to ensure Colonel Prescott's silence. Miss Thorne, to protect the girl she considered a daughter, and Sarah herself, acting out of a lifetime of rejection and fresh, venomous hatred from a man who should have cherished her. One of them had come after Mr. Hendosen's panic flight. One of them had found the Colonel wounded, grasped the silver sceptre, and with cold finality ended his life. The question was, which one? My course was clear. I had to confront Miss Thorne. A direct approach was now the only path forward. I found her not in her garden, but in her drawing room at the Laurels, sitting perfectly still in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a judge awaiting a trial. The room was dark, the curtains half-drawn, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and dried lavender. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice devoid of surprise. "I have been expecting you. The village has been buzzing. I understand you have been speaking with everyone. It was only a matter of time. The truth is a way of insisting upon itself, Miss Thorne, I replied, taking the seat she indicated opposite her, even when it has been buried for many years. And what truth have you unearthed? She asked, her hawk-like eyes fixed on me. I know about Sarah, I said simply. I know she is Colonel Prescott's daughter. There was no gasp, no flinch, only a slow, deliberate blink. She had been prepared for this. I see. And you believe this gives her a motive for murder? A girl who wouldn't hurt a fly. I believe it gives someone a powerful motive, I corrected gently. The colonel discovered the truth from the old sanctuary register and threatened to make it public. Such a revelation would have been devastating for Sarah. It would have also been inconvenient for you. Inconvenient? A flicker of ice entered her voice. Try catastrophic. For Sarah. She is a sensitive soul. To be publicly branded a bastard and rejected by the very man whose name she bears, it would have broken her. I have spent my life building a wall of respectability around her. Arthur Prescott was determined to tear it down. So you went to see him that night. I pressed. In the bell tower. He summoned you, just as he summoned Mr. Henderson. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. He did. He left a note for me, demanding I meet him there. He said he had conclusive evidence, and that the matter would be settled once and for all. I assumed he meant the Fête Queen. I was wrong. And what did you find when you arrived? I found him dead, she stated flatly, slumped against the bell. That gaudy sceptre was in his chest. It was a shocking, grotesque sight. Her story was plausible. It aligned with Henderson's confession, but it left a crucial question unanswered. What did you do then? I asked. I did what any sensible person would do. I turned to leave, to alert the vicar or the constable, but as I turned, I saw it. Her eyes lost their focus, looking at something in the middle distance. On the stone floor, near his foot, a small, silver locket. Sarah's locket, the one her mother gave her. She never takes it off. The air in the room grew colder. This was new. A locket. I knew then. Miss Thorne continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I knew she had been there. I knew she must have come before me, that they had argued. He had finally pushed her too far. In a moment of passion, she must have, I don't know, pushed him. He fell, and the sceptre, it was a tragic accident. An accident? I repeated. The wound was described as precise. A single, powerful thrust. Panic can lend unnatural strength, she countered swiftly. She is a strong girl from her post office work. She must have fled in terror, dropping her locket. So I did what I had to do. And what was that? I picked up the locket. I put it in my pocket. And I left. I said nothing. I had protected that child her entire life. I was not about to see her life destroyed over that man's final, cruel act. It was a compelling story. A story of supreme, if misguided, loyalty. The devoted guardian cleaning up the mess of a tragic accident to protect her charge. It painted her as morally ambiguous, but not as a murderer. It placed the blame squarely on Sarah. But something did not sit right. It was too neat. The dropped locket, the convenient accident. It felt like a performance, a story crafted not just for me, but rehearsed for her own conscience. That is a remarkable burden to carry, Miss Thorne, I said softly, to conceal such a thing from the police. Love requires sacrifice, Miss Marple, she said, her gaze sharpening again, challenging me. Something a spinster like yourself might not fully comprehend. It was a deliberate barb designed to wound and to end the conversation. I did not rise to it. Instead, I rose to leave. Thank you for your candor, I said. It has been most illuminating. I walked out of the dark cottage into the afternoon light, my mind racing. 2 stories. Henderson's confession of a panicked struggle. And now, Miss Thorne's tale of finding a body and discovering Sarah's locket. Both pointed away from themselves. Both pointed towards an accidental death. But I knew it was not an accident. The final, deliberate thrust of the sceptre was an act of cold intent. Someone had wanted the colonel dead, and they had used the chaos of Henderson's struggle to achieve it. I needed to speak to Sarah one last time. I needed to ask her about the locket. If Miss Thorne was lying about it, then her whole story crumbled, and her motive for being in the bell tower shifted from clean-up crew to something far more sinister. I hurried back to the post office, but it was closed and shuttered. A neighbor said they had seen Sarah walking quickly towards a woods on the edge of the village, looking terribly upset. A cold dread settled in my stomach. If Sarah had indeed been the second visitor, Miss Thorne's confrontation might have pushed her to despair. Oh, if Miss Thorne was a killer and Sarah knew it, the weight of that knowledge could be equally devastating. I turned and walked as fast as my old legs would carry me, not toward the woods, but towards a police house. I had held my knowledge close for long enough. It was time to share my map of the territory with Inspector Martin. The final act was approaching, and I feared it would not end in a drawing room, but in tragedy. The Serpent in the Sanctuary, Part 7, The Lie in the Locket. Time, I felt, was slipping through my fingers like sand. Miss Thorne's story of the locket had introduced a new, dangerous variable. If true, it meant a terrified Sarah was somewhere, burdened with a secret she believed was murder. If false, it meant Miss Thorne was not merely a protector, but a consummate liar who had crafted a perfect scapegoat. I found Inspector Morton at the police house, poring over maps of the village with Sergeant Leyland. "Inspector," I said, my voice betraying my urgency, "I must speak with you. It is a matter of some gravity." Morton looked up, his weary face etched with frustration. "Miss Marple, unless you have a signed confession, I have a missing girl to find. Sarah Wainwright has disappeared." My heart sank. "That is precisely what I have come about. I believe I know why, but you are looking for the wrong culprit." I proceeded to tell him everything. I laid out the entire tragic tapestry, the embezzlement, Henderson's panicked struggle, the secret of Sarah's parentage, and finally, Miss Thorne's claim about finding the locket. I watched his expression shift from skepticism to intense focus. "So you have two confessions of a sort," Sergeant Leyland summarized, her pen flying across her notebook. "Henderson admits to the struggle in the wound, but claims it was an accident. Miss Thorne admits to being at the scene and tampering with evidence, but claims you were protecting Sarah from a murder charge." "Precisely, Sergeant," I said, "but they cannot both be entirely truthful. The crucial element is a locket. Miss Thorne stated that Sarah * never * takes it off. If that is so, its presence at the scene is damning. But if it is not true, then Miss Thorne is lying through her teeth," Morton finished, his eyes narrowing, "and she planted the story to frame the girl she claims to protect." He stood up, his decision made. "Right. We'll bring Miss Thorne in for further questioning. And we need to find that Wainwright girl before she does something foolish." "There is one more person who might know the truth of the locket," I ventured. "Chloe Prescott. She was Sarah's rival, her observer. If anyone would know the habits of the girl she resented, it would be her." We found Chloe not at the Grange, but in the churchyard, sitting on a bench near her uncle's fresh grave. She looked up as we approached, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "Chloe," Inspector Morton began, not unkindly, "we need to ask you about Sarah Wainwright. Did you ever see her wear a silver locket?" Chloe frowned, a bitter twist to her mouth. "A locket? Yes, a cheap little thing. She was always fiddling with it." "Why?" "Did she wear it always? Never take it off?" I asked. "No, not always," Chloe said, a hint of scorn in her voice. "She took it off to work at the post office. Said the chain got caught on the parcels. I saw her put it in her apron pocket dozens of times. She was very careless with it. Really, hardly the treasured heirloom she made it out to be." A quiet triumph bloomed in my chest. The foundation of Miss Thorne's story was cracked. Sarah did take the locket off. It could easily have been lost elsewhere. Miss Thorne had chosen a detail she thought was incontrovertible, but it was based on a public performance, not private habit. Just then, a young constable came running up, out of breath. "Sir, we've found her. Sarah Wainwright. She's at Oakwood Lodge." The old sanctuary, of course, where it all began. We drove to the secluded, slightly dilapidated house on the edge of the village. The front door was ajar. We found Sarah in the grand, dusty drawing room, sitting on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest. She wasn't crying. She was just staring into the empty fireplace, the fabled silver locket clutched tightly in her hand. "Sarah," Inspector Morton said, his voice gentle but firm, "we need you to come with us." She looked up, her eyes hollow. "I know. She told me you'd come for me." "Who told you?" I asked, stepping forward. "Miss Thorne. She found me here an hour ago. She said it was only a matter of time before the police piece it together. She said my locket was found near Uncle Arthur, that I must have dropped it when we argued." She looked at the trinket in her hand. "But I didn't. I know I didn't. I hadn't worn it for 2 days because the clasp was broken. I only came here to feel close to my mother, to think." The final piece of the lie was exposed. Miss Thorne had not only concocted the story, she had come here to reinforce it, to gaslight a grieving girl into believing she was a killer. "What did you and the Colonel argue about, Sarah?" I asked softly. "He told me who my father was," she whispered. "He said it was a disgrace. He said I should leave St. Mary Mead and never return. I was angry. I was so angry. I told him he was a coward, that he was a disgrace for denying me my whole life. I did go to the bell tower that night, after he summoned me. But when I got there, the door at the bottom was open. I heard voices from above, his and a man's, arguing. I was too frightened to go up. I turned and ran. I never saw him alive." Her alibi was simple and had the ring of truth. She had fled from the conflict, not towards it. She had heard Henderson. "Bring Miss Thorne to the station," Morton ordered Sergeant Leyland, his voice hard. "Now." Back at the police station, under the stark electric light, Miss Thorne's composure began to fracture. Confronted with the evidence that the locket story was a fabrication, her defense shifted from noble sacrifice to cold justification. She was weak. Miss Thorne finally snapped, her voice losing its cultured precision, becoming shrill. She would have confessed to anything, crumbled under the pressure. I built a life for her, and she was going to let him destroy it. He was going to shout her name from the rooftops, brand her a bastard for all to see. "So you went to the bell tower after Henderson fled," Morton stated. "You found the colonel wounded, but alive." "Alive and spitting venom," she cried. "He saw me and he smiled, that horrible, triumphant smile. He said, 'You see, Lavinia, I win. The rot will be cleansed.' He was holding his side, bleeding, but he was still gloating. And I saw the sceptre lying on the floor where that fool Henderson had dropped it. And I thought, why should he win? Why should he destroy that innocent girl after a lifetime of ignoring her? Why should he get to have the final word?" Her eyes were blazing with a fervor that was terrifying to behold. This was not the calm, collected spinster. This was a woman possessed by a lifetime of hidden passions and resentments. "So you picked it up," I said, my voice quiet in the tense room. "I did what had to be done," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I picked up the scepter. I looked him in the eye, and I put it where his heart should have been. It was justice. For Sarah. For her mother. For all the girls he and men like him use and discard. It was not murder. It was an execution." There was a stunned silence in the room. The confession was complete. The serpent had not been a stranger, or a panicked embezzler, or a rejected daughter. It had been the village's self-appointed moral guardian, whose love had curdled into a fanatical, murderous obsession. As they led her away, she looked at me one last time, her composure returning like a mask. "You think you understand, Jane Marple, with your knitting and your gentle wisdom, but you have no idea what it is to love someone enough to damn your own soul for them." I did not reply. I simply watched her go, feeling not triumph, but an immense, weary sadness. The sanctuary she had tried to create had become a prison of her own making, and the final, terrible act had been her own. The serpent in the sanctuary, Part 8, the quiet aftermath. A village does not easily recover from a revelation such as ours. The arrest of Miss Lavinia Thorne sent a shock through St. Mary Mead that was far deeper and more unsettling than the murder itself. A body in the bell tower was a horror, but the unmasking of one of our most respected pillars as a cold-blooded killer struck at the very heart of our community. It called into question everything we thought we knew about our neighbors and about ourselves. The following days were a blur of official statements and private tears. Mr. Henderson, his secret laid bare, resigned from the bank in disgrace. The embezzlement charges were weighed against his corporation, but his life in the village was effectively over. He became a ghost, seen occasionally packing his belongings into a small motor car before disappearing from Dunroman forever. His fear of exposure had set the stage for the tragedy, but it was Miss Thorne who had written the final, bloody act. Sarah Wainwright was, as one might expect, utterly shattered. The woman who had been her sole protector, her guiding star, was revealed to be a murderess. And the grim irony that her guardian had killed her own father, however despicable he may have been, was a burden no young woman should have to bear. Dorothy Bantry, to her credit, stepped in with a rough, practical kindness, ensuring Sarah was not alone in her small room above the post office. But the light in the girl's eyes had been extinguished. She was a soul adrift, her sanctuary revealed to be a lie. It was a week after the arrest that Inspector Morton paid me a final visit. He found me in my garden, where I often go to order my thought amongst the predictable cycles of nature. "Miss Marple," he said, taking the seat I offered on the wrought iron bench. "I come not on official business, but to thank you. Your local knowledge was invaluable. I merely provided a few threads. Inspector, I demurred. You and Sergeant Leyland wove them into the tapestry of justice." He gave a short, dry laugh. "A grim tapestry. It's a sordid business. Embezzlement, illegitimacy, and a murder disguised as righteous justice." "Miss Thorne truly believed it was justice," I said, looking out at my rosies. "That is what makes it so terribly sad. She saw herself not as a criminal, but as an avenging angel. Love, when it becomes twisted and possessive, can be the most dangerous motive of all, far more dangerous than greed or fear." Speaking of fear, Morton said, Henderson's statement checked out. The forensics on the torn ledger page he described, the placement of the wound. It all supports his story of a panicked struggle. He'll face charges for the embezzlement and for failing to report a death, but not for murder. The fatal thrust was, as he deduced, delivered after he fled. Miss Thorne's was a confession of cold intent. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the bees among the flowers. "She asked to see you, you know," he said quietly. I turned to look at him. "Miss Thorne?" He nodded. "She's at Budgenham Prison, awaiting trial." She was quite insistent. "I can arrange it, if you wish." I did wish. There were questions that still lingered in my mind, not about the facts of the case, but about the human heart behind them. The visiting room was a cold, echoing space, all hard surfaces and the smell of disinfectant. Miss Thorne sat on the other side of a scarred wooden table, dressed in a drab, institutional garment. Yet her posture was as regal as ever, her hair still perfectly arranged. Her spirit, it seemed, had not been broken, only confined. "Jane," she said, her voice calm, as if we were meeting in her drawing room. "I knew you would come. You have that kind of mind. You need to see the final chapter for yourself." "I came because you asked for me, Lavinia," I replied, "and because I wanted to understand." "Understand what?" "Why I killed a man who deserved killing." "Perhaps. Or perhaps I wanted to understand when the protection of a child became the destruction of all you held dear." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. The moment I saw him lying there, bleeding, but still so full of hate, it was an opportunity, Jane. A gift. Henderson had done the messy part. All that was required was a final, decisive stroke. It wasn't rage. It was clarity. For the first time in my life, I saw a problem and its solution with perfect, absolute clarity. And Sarah, I asked, was framing her for the murder part of that clarity. Her composure wavered for a single, fleeting second. That was a miscalculation, a necessary lie. I thought she would be the one person no one would suspect. I thought I could guide the narrative, as I have always guided things in the village. I overestimated my control. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense. "But you must see, it was all for her. Everything I have ever done, since the day her mother died in my arms, was for her. No, Lavinia, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. It was for you. It was about your promise, your control, your vision of what her life should be. You loved the idea of Sarah, the girl you saved, but you never trusted her to be strong enough to survive the truth. In the end, your love was a cage. She stared at me, and for a moment, I saw not a murderess, but a terribly lonely, frightened old woman whose entire life had been built around a single, consuming purpose that had now crumbled to dust. She had no reply. I left the prison soon after, the image of her isolated figure etched in my mind. The trial that followed was a swift, grim affair. Miss Lavinia Thorne was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. There were no triumphant cheers, only a solemn, communal sigh. The St. Mary Mead Summer Garden fete was, of course, cancelled. It seemed a trivial thing, but its absence was a quiet acknowledgment of the wound we had suffered. Life, as it always does, slowly began to continue. New patterns formed. Sarah eventually left the village, seeking anonymity and a fresh start in a place with no memories. The Grange was put up for sale. I often think of it all as I sit here in my garden. The serpent was not some outside evil that slithered into our midst. It was born and nurtured within our own walls, fed by pride, secrecy, and a love that turned to poison. It is a reminder that the most perfect sanctuary can be corrupted from within, and that the greatest mysteries are not those of how, but of why. And as the English rain begins to fall softly on my roses, I find a small comfort in the knowledge that while evil can touch the most tranquil of places, so too can the quiet, persistent forces of truth and justice, which, like the most delicate of flowers, have deep and resilient roots.